There's a moment nobody prepares you for. It comes at the end of the hardest stretch of your life, after you've done everything they asked you to do, and more, and it arrives in the most ordinary way imaginable. You walk through a set of glass doors, you look at a parking lot, and the car that was supposed to be there isn't. I'm Gideon Farris, 59 years old, retired shop teacher, 35 years at Jefferson High School in Fort Wayne, Indiana, husband, which was the word that mattered most to me for 31 years, until ovarian cancer made it past tense 22 months ago, and father of one son who was 32 years old, who had stood in the lobby of Willowbrook Behavioral Health 8 weeks earlier, hugged me in a way he hadn't hugged me since he was 13 and said, "I'll be here. 10 o'clock, Thursday, I promise." He wasn't there. But I need to back up because this story doesn't start in that parking lot. It starts 2 years before that Thursday in my own kitchen on a Tuesday night in October when I stood at the counter at 9:30 in the evening holding a coffee mug and couldn't remember whether I'd eaten that day. I had been retired for 6 months. My wife, 31 years, the woman who sang off-key to country radio while she washed dishes and didn't care one bit that she was off-key, who cried at every single one of my students' graduation photos I ever brought home because she said she just couldn't help it, that watching someone become who they were going to be was one of those things that simply got her. My wife, Bet, had been gone for 4 months. And somewhere in those 4 months, I had quietly stopped participating in my own life. That's the honest way to say it. I wasn't dangerous, I wasn't doing anything dramatic, I was just absent. Present in the body, gone somewhere else in every way that counted. Going through the daily motions of a man who technically existed, waking up, making coffee, occasionally remembering to shower, but with the engine behind the eyes gone somewhere quiet and dark and not answering. When grief stops being something you feel and becomes the structure of how you move through rooms, that's when it gets harder than people who haven't been there can quite imagine. My son noticed before I was willing to. That matters, and I want to say so plainly. He drove up from Indianapolis on a Sunday in March, sat across from me at the kitchen table where Bet and I had eaten 11 years of dinners, and said, "Dad, I need you to talk to someone." I told him I was fine. He said, "I know you believe that. That's exactly what worries me." We found Willowbrook, a residential behavioral health center outside Indianapolis. Not a hospital, more of a place where people whose grief or depression had grown bigger than they could carry alone could set it down for a while and figure out how to pick it back up differently. He drove me there on a Sunday in November, walked me to the front desk, hugged me in the lobby, and said he'd be back in 8 weeks at 10 in the morning. I want to tell you what those 8 weeks actually were, because the easy version of this story skips that part, and the easy version isn't honest. What those 8 weeks were was group therapy at 8 in the morning, 6 days a week, in plastic chairs that were slightly too small, in a room with windows that looked out onto a courtyard where nothing much was growing in November or December or January. What they were was sitting across from a therapist who asked the kind of questions that had no comfortable answers, and then waited, with no apparent hurry, while I found out what mine were. What they were was a circle of 7 other people who had each lost something they hadn't figured out how to survive without. Men who had retired and immediately lost their sense of direction. Women who had spent 30 years raising children who were grown now, and the house was silent, and nothing inside them knew what to do with that silence. We told the truth in that circle, not the cleaned-up version, not the eulogy version, the real kind, the kind that has been living in your chest so long it's gone load-bearing, and the only way to find out if removing it is survivable is to try. I talked about Bet the way she actually was, her laugh that always arrived a half-second late, like it had traveled to reach the room, the way she had managed to make every house we lived in feel genuinely glad you came home. The way she told me 3 weeks before the end, with the particular directness that comes to people when they don't have the energy left for anything indirect, that I was not under any circumstances allowed to stop living just because she had to. "You hear me, Gideon," she said. Not a question. I heard her. I just hadn't understood yet what hearing her was going to require of me. I did the work, 8 weeks, every session, every exercise, every conversation I would rather have avoided. I cried in that room in front of strangers, and I was not ashamed of it, because that room had earned those tears, and so had I. So you'll understand what it meant to stand at the entrance of Willowbrook at 10:15 on a Thursday morning in February, manila envelope under my arm, and not see my son's car. My wallet was in that envelope, $63 in cash, 2 20s, 2 10s, 3 singles, my driver's license, and a Costco card expired since October. My phone, which had died somewhere in week 3 and made no promises about recovery, and Bettett's locket, silver with a photograph inside so tiny you needed good light to see us in it, taken at a friend's lake house the summer before our son was born. I had carried it in my left pocket every single day for 22 months. I was not about to stop now. I stood by the window near the entrance and watched a young couple pull up in a green SUV and climb out and fold a woman between them in a hug that lasted the better part of a full minute. I watched an older gentleman in a heavy parka get guided to a waiting sedan by a daughter who was crying while she smiled, trying to hide both. I watched a church van pull up for a man about my age, and 3 people climbed out of that van. 3 people who had driven from wherever that congregation was located specifically to collect this man, and they stood around him in the February cold like they were forming a wall between him and the weather. No one came for me. At 11:40, I stood up, tucked the envelope under my arm, and pushed through the front doors. The February air in central Indiana hits you flat and matter-of-fact, not the dramatic cold of a storm. Just the quiet, unapologetic cold of a state that has been cold in February since before anyone was around to have an opinion about it. 4 blocks east was a bus stop I had located on the shared computer in the common room 2 weeks prior, at 10 o'clock on a night when some quiet and practical part of me had looked it up without quite admitting to itself why. I made it down the front steps and about 12 paces into the parking lot. Mr. Farris. Not a question, the way a name sounds when someone drove it somewhere with the intention of saying it out loud. I turned around. He was mid-30s, broad through the shoulders in the way men get when they've spent a decade doing actual physical work. Carhartt jacket, work boots with real miles on them. A face I recognized the way you recognize faces after a long time has passed. The melody arriving before the words, the structure before the name. Floyd Keene? He had sat in my 3rd period construction trades elective in 2007, quiet, concentrated, the kind of student who came fully alive when there was a tool in his hands and understood without being told that a good joint required patience and not just pressure. He had failed sophomore English twice, and nobody around him had expected much. In my shop, he built a bookcase in 8 weeks that a grown craftsman would have been proud. I had written him a letter of recommendation for a vocational program and never learned whether he used it. The lettering on the side of his truck said Keene Construction, established 2014. Floyd, I said. The name came out rougher than I intended. He looked at me with the direct expression of a man who had made a decision before he drove there and wasn't going to retreat from it. How long have you been standing out here? About an hour and a half. He nodded once, the nod of a man confirming information he had already suspected. I've got coffee in the truck, and I need you to hear something before you make any calls. He reached inside his jacket and produced a folded document. I received a work order 6 weeks ago, he said. Prep and staging work on a property at 418 Linden Drive. He held my eyes steady. I always drive by first before I commit to a job. I recognize the house, Mr. Farris. You taught an entire unit on reading load-bearing walls using photographs of your own addition. I remembered every one of those photos. He paused. The listing agreement on file with the county recorder has your signature on it. I've seen your actual handwriting on an estimate you approved 11 years ago when I was subcontracting a job on your block. That was not your signature. I stood in the February cold and received that information the way cold comes in, not all at once, layer by layer, each one deeper than the one before. My son, I said. Doesn't know the whole picture? Floyd said carefully. A colleague of mine who handles property fraud cases pulled the communication records on the listing. He measured what he was about to say. Your son received a call in December. He was told that you had contacted the facility, that you said the house held too much without your wife, that returning there wasn't something you felt you could do, that you'd asked for it to be handled while you were still receiving care. I heard that, standing outside in the cold with $63 in Bet's locket and a dead phone. The silence that followed was the completest silence I had stood in for a long time. My son had not moved on. My son had not decided I wasn't worth the drive. My son had received, from the person he trusted above anyone else in the world, a careful and specific and detailed account of what his father had asked for, and he had believed it because he had no reason not to, because that is what love requires you to do until you learn it shouldn't. I thought about my daughter-in-law, about a Thanksgiving 3 years earlier when she had asked me thoughtful, interested questions about the house, the lot size, the foundation, what I thought the appraisal might come in at these days. And I had thought she was just the kind of person who asked a lot of questions. I thought about how she had sat beside my son in Willowbrook's family consultation room in November and held his hand and said all the right things to the counselor about support systems and healthy environments and making sure I had what I needed. I thought about Bettit's reading chair, her books, the photographs in the hallway, being boxed up and moved to storage while I sat in group therapy talking about how much I missed her. I got in the truck. Floyd drove and talked, and I listened with the discipline that 8 weeks had built in me, the discipline of receiving hard things without letting them take the wheel. The full picture came in layers, each worse than the one before it. The listing had been placed 6 days after I entered Willowbrook. A moving company had been contacted within the first 2 weeks. Betty's chair was in a storage unit on the east side of Fort Wayne, along with her books, her mugs, the photographs, inventoried and sealed, waiting for a sale that had been arranged without my knowledge or consent by a person who had calculated that a man diminished by grief and temporarily out of reach was unlikely to push back before the transaction was complete. The open house was scheduled for that Saturday. Here is what 42 days of serious therapy actually teaches you. Not calm, not the smoothed down version of a person. What it teaches you is that in the space between feeling something and doing something, there is a choice. That choice is the only territory you actually own, and a man who has learned to own that territory is very, very difficult to manage. I chose to wait until Saturday. Floyd set me up in a motel near the facility, decent heat vending machine at the end of the hall, a bed that was adequate for a man who needed to sleep and think and not contact anyone before he was ready. He checked in Thursday evening and again on Friday. I ate soup heated in the lobby microwave. I thought about Bet, not the drowning kind of thinking that had brought me to Willowbrook, but something quieter, more like a conversation I was finally able to hold without going under. I thought about what she would have seen in this situation that I might be missing. She had always seen things first. And I found in the manila envelope the letter. I had written it in week 4, the hardest week, the one where the therapy had reached things I had been keeping compressed for a very long time, and the world outside felt so remote, I wasn't certain I was still attached to it. 3 pages on Willowbrook letterhead, handwritten, never intended for anyone to read. The kind of letter that exists because if you don't write it, you will hold it in your body until it damages something. I wrote it to my son. About the first time I put a hammer in his hands, when he was 6 years old and he drove a nail perfectly true on his 3rd try and looked up at me with the purest expression of surprised joy I had ever seen on a human face. About the night before he left for college when neither of us knew what to say, and so we sat in the garage together and I showed him how to change his own oil, step by step, slowly, because the task gave us somewhere to put our hands. About his mother, about how losing her wasn't only grief but losing the person who had helped me understand my own self, who had translated me to myself in ways I hadn't known I needed until they were gone. About how I needed him to know that I was still here, that 8 weeks away did not mean done, that whatever the rest of my life looked like, I intended for him to be in it, and I intended to be someone worth having in his. I had that letter in my coat pocket on Saturday morning when Floyd drove me to 418 Linden Drive. The open house sign stood at the end of my own driveway. A real estate agent I had never seen before stood in my front hallway, distributing printed flyers with a photograph of my kitchen on the cover. 7 or 8 people moved through the rooms with the detached, evaluating quiet of people imagining their furniture in someone else's space. My daughter-in-law was in the living room. She turned when she heard the door, the way you turn when you're expecting someone from the agency, and her face moved through 3 expressions in under 2 seconds. Recognition, calculation, and then the particular blankness of a person who is deciding very quickly to become unreadable. I did not move toward her. I did not raise my voice. I did not give her the confrontation she had already prepared a response to, with the practiced sorrow of a woman who had thought through every version of this conversation, except the one where I simply wasn't the man she had left in that parking lot. I walked through my own house. Through the living room where Bet's reading chair was missing, its outline still pressed faintly into the carpet where it had sat for years. Down the hallway where the photographs had been lifted from their hooks, the small holes still visible in the paint. Into the kitchen where 14 coffee mugs, she had never been able to pass a good one in a shop, and I had never once minded, were gone from the shelf above the sink. The shelf was bare and clean, like someone had wiped it down after. I stood in that kitchen for a long moment, with $63 in my wallet and Bet's locket in my left pocket and a letter to my son in my right, and I felt something settle in me completely, without drama, without performance, just settled, the way a door settles when someone finally closes it the way it was built to close. I walked back to the front hallway. I introduced myself to the listing agent as the owner of record of the property at 418 Linden Drive. The color left her face at approximately the same rate it had left my daughter-in-law's in the living room. Floyd's colleague had prepared a full packet, The signature analysis comparing the forged document to verified samples of my handwriting, the call logs, the moving company invoice dated 9 days after my admission, a timeline of every action taken against my property from November onward. I handed it to the agent without commentary, the way a man hands over information when he knows the information is sufficient and does not require amplification. The open house concluded in approximately 11 minutes. The legal process that followed moved the way legal processes move when the documentation is thorough and the underlying act is not subtle. A complaint was filed with the Indiana Professional Licensing Agency. A separate referral went to the Marion County Prosecutor's Office, where a deputy prosecutor reviewed the forgery analysis and the timeline and used the word straightforward in a way that was not a compliment to the person who had done it. The listing agent, whose license was now at significant risk for having accepted a seller's signature without in-person verification, retained her own counsel and cooperated fully and promptly. My daughter-in-law had made a calculation. She had looked at a grieving man of 59, recently admitted to a behavioral health facility, temporarily without resources or mobility, and she had decided he was a problem that could be repositioned before he recovered enough clarity to notice. She had been precise about it. She had been patient. She had thought of nearly everything. She had not thought about Floyd Keene, who had been 12 years old when I wrote on his permanent record that I believed he had the focus and the integrity to build something real, and who had driven to a behavioral health center in February to return the favor 20 years later. She had not thought about what 8 weeks of honest, unflinching work does to a man. It doesn't make him gentle, it makes him clear. I called my son from the motel on Saturday evening. He answered before the second ring. I did not start with the documents. I did not start with the open house. I read him the letter. All 3 pages, over the phone, from the beginning, the hammer and the nail driven true on the 3rd try. The oil change the night before college. His mother and what she had given us both, and what I was still learning how to carry without her. And the last part, which I had written in the 4th week when I was not sure I was going to be all right and was writing to him anyway, because some things need to be said regardless. That I was still here, that I was going to still be here, that he was in the inventory of reasons why, and had been since the day he was born, and that was not going to change. When I finished, the silence on the line lasted long enough that I checked the connection. Then he said quietly, "She told me you called in December." "I know," I said. "She had brochures, Dad, for a senior apartment complex. She said you'd already toured it online, that you'd told her." He stopped. His voice had gone to the careful register he used when he was trying to hold a feeling back from the sentence. "She had an answer for everything I asked." "She's thorough," I said. "I'll give her that." Another silence, longer than that signature on the listing agreement. Wasn't mine. He came to Fort Wayne the next morning with his truck. He brought Bettit's reading chair back from the storage unit first, then 2 trips for boxes. We put everything back where it had been. The chair by the window, the photographs on the hallway hooks, every one of the coffee mugs on the shelf above the sink. We didn't say much while we worked. Sometimes the work is the conversation, and that's enough, and maybe it's better. He comes on Sundays now. We are building a proper workbench in the garage. The one Bet always wanted me to finish, so I would stop taking over the kitchen table with half-done projects. We spend about an hour on actual construction and 2 hours standing around talking about things of no particular importance. His week, a game we half-watched, something funny that happened that doesn't translate well, but we try anyway. I've come to believe that ratio is exactly right for a father and a grown son who are finding their way back to each other. You don't rush it. You just show up, and you keep showing up, and eventually the distance closes on its own. I want to leave you with something, and I want it to be the true thing rather than the easy thing. Getting help is not the same as being diminished. I spent too long believing those were the same act. They are not even in the same county. The version of me that walked through those glass doors in February was not the version that entered them in November. He was steadier. He knew what he was made of in a way that made him very difficult to subtract from his own life. The people who counted on my absence were counting on me staying broken. They were counting on the grief and the silence and the dead phone and the belief that a parking lot being empty says something permanent about the man standing in it. It doesn't. Floyd Keene was not a coincidence, and he was not a miracle. He was the return on something Bet believed in and acted on every day of her life. The belief that the decent things you do for people go somewhere, even when you can't see where, especially when you can't see where. She had made him feel, in the 3 years he was in my classroom, that someone saw what he was capable of before he could see it himself. That was her. That was exactly and completely who she was. And 20 years later, a man she had never stopped believing in showed up in a February parking lot with coffee and the truth, because that is where those things eventually land. The bench is almost finished. Her chair is by the window where it belongs. The locket is in my left pocket, same as every morning for 2 years. My son called on a Tuesday last week with no particular reason at all. Just to check in, just to talk, the best kind of call there is. I heard you, Bet. I'm still here.